wine ran out at exactly the wrong moment, and the servant's hands trembled as he lifted the empty clay jar. 200 guests were still celebrating, dancing, laughing, completely unaware that the family's reputation was about to be destroyed right before their eyes. In first-century Jewish culture, running out of wine at your wedding wasn't just embarrassing. It was a social catastrophe that would follow the family for generations. And it was about to happen. But there was something nobody knew yet. The wedding had started 3 days earlier, as was the custom in Cana. The groom's family had saved for years, planning every detail to honor their son and his new bride. They had calculated the wine carefully, or so they thought. Marriages in their culture lasted an entire week, with feasting, music, and celebration from dawn until midnight. To run out of provisions was to dishonor not just your family, but every guest who had traveled to be there. Mary, the mother of Jesus, had been watching the servants with growing concern. She had noticed their increasingly frantic whispers, the way they kept checking the storage room, counting and recounting jars that were already empty. She knew what was coming before anyone else did. And this is exactly where everything changed. Mary moved quietly through the celebration until she found her son. Jesus was sitting with several other guests, engaged in conversation, seemingly unaware of the crisis brewing behind the scenes. But Mary knew her son. She had watched him grow from a miraculous birth to a man of 30 years. She had treasured mysteries in her heart for decades, angelic announcements, prophetic words, strange occurrences that defied explanation. She didn't fully understand who he was or what he was meant to do, but she knew he was different, special, capable of things others were not. "They have no more wine," she said simply, her voice low but urgent. Jesus looked up at his mother, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. "Woman, why do you involve me?" he replied, and though the words might have seemed harsh, his tone was gentle. "My hour has not yet come." Wait a second. Don't miss this detail. Mary didn't argue. She didn't explain or plead. She simply turned to the nearby servants and said 5 words that would change everything. "Do whatever he tells you." Then she walked away, leaving Jesus sitting there with a decision to make. The servants stood frozen, confused, looking between this woman who had just given them instructions and this man who apparently held some kind of authority. They didn't know yet that they were about to witness something impossible. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. Jesus stood and walked toward the stone water jars that lined the wall. There were 6 of them, massive containers used for Jewish ceremonial washing. Each jar could hold 20 to 30 gallons, enormous vessels that would take multiple servants to fill. They were empty now, drained from the ceremonial washing that guests had performed upon arrival days earlier. "Fill the jars with water," Jesus said to the servants. The servants exchanged glances. Water? The problem was wine, not water. What good would filling ceremonial washing jars do for a wine shortage? But something in Jesus' voice commanded obedience. Perhaps it was Mary's instruction still ringing in their ears, or perhaps it was something they saw in his eyes. A quiet certainty that made arguing seem foolish. They began hauling water from the well. Trip after trip, bucket after bucket, they filled those massive stone jars to the very brim. It was exhausting work, and the whole time they kept glancing toward the celebration where the crisis was still unfolding. The wine steward would discover the shortage any moment. The announcement would be made. The family would be shamed. But what was truly shocking was coming next. When the last jar was filled, the servants stood breathing heavily, waiting for the next instruction. Jesus looked at the water-filled vessels, and for just a moment something flickered across his face, a recognition that what he was about to do would change everything. This would be his first public miracle. Once it happened, there would be no going back to the quiet life of a carpenter in Nazareth. "Now draw some out," Jesus said quietly, "and take it to the master of the banquet." The servants stared at him. Take water to the wine steward. They would be laughed at, possibly beaten for mocking the situation. You don't serve water at a wedding feast. You certainly don't present it to the master of ceremonies as if it were something valuable. But they had been told to do whatever he said. One servant dipped a cup into the nearest jar, and the moment the liquid poured out, everything changed. It wasn't water. The color was deep red, rich and dark. The aroma hit them immediately. Complex, full-bodied, unmistakably wine. The servant's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the cup. He looked at Jesus with wide eyes, but Jesus simply nodded toward the master of the banquet. What you've seen so far is nothing compared to what happened next. The servant carried the cup across the courtyard, weaving through dancing guests, his mind reeling. He had filled those jars himself. He had poured water from the well with his own hands. He had watched it splash into those stone containers, clear and tasteless. And now it was wine. Not just wine, but wine that smelled better than anything they had served all week. The master of the banquet took the cup without really looking at the servant. He was busy overseeing the celebration, managing the flow of food and drink, ensuring everything ran smoothly. He raised the cup to his lips almost absently, taking a drink while his attention was elsewhere. Then he froze. His eyes widened. He looked down at the cup in his hand as if it had just spoken to him. He took another drink, slower this time, savoring it. Then another. His expression shifted from surprise to confusion to something like wonder. You won't believe what he did immediately after. The master of the banquet stood up so quickly, his chair nearly toppled backward. He pushed through the crowd, searching for the groom, ignoring people who tried to get his attention. When he found him, he grabbed the young man's arm and pulled him aside, away from the other guests. "Everyone brings out the choice wine first," the master of the banquet said, his voice loud with amazement and perhaps a touch of confusion. "And then the cheaper wine, after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." The groom's face went blank. Best wine. He knew exactly how much wine they had purchased, exactly what quality it was, and he knew for certain that it had all been served. They had nothing left. That's why he'd been dreading the next hour, knowing the announcement of shortage would come any moment. "I don't understand," the groom stammered. "We already served everything we had. Where did this come from?" But the master of the banquet wasn't listening. He was already calling for more, gesturing to the servants to bring out whatever remaining supply this magnificent wine had come from. The servants, the ones who knew the truth, looked at each other with expressions of pure shock. They moved toward those 6 stone jars like men in a dream. And this is where the most incredible moment occurred. When they began drawing from the jars, they discovered that all 6 were full of wine. Not just the one they'd drawn from initially, but all of them. 120 to 180 gallons of wine, enough to keep the celebration going for weeks, not just the remaining days of the wedding feast. And every drop of it was extraordinary, better than anything that had been served before, better than most of these guests had ever tasted in their lives. The servants kept glancing at Jesus, who had quietly returned to his seat. He wasn't making any announcement. He wasn't drawing attention to what had happened. He simply sat there, watching, while the celebration continued and improved around him. Only his disciples sitting nearby had noticed the exchange. They had seen him speak to the servants. They had watched the confusion turn to wonder on the servants' faces. And now, they sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. John would later write that this was the first of Jesus' miraculous signs, performed in Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. But in that moment, it was so quiet, so understated, that most of the celebration continued without anyone knowing a miracle had occurred. But there was something even more profound happening beneath the surface. The wine steward kept praising the groom for his wisdom in saving the best for last. The groom accepted the praise with confused gratitude, still trying to understand where this wine had come from. The bride's family relaxed, their relief palpable. The potential disaster had been averted somehow, miraculously. The guests danced and laughed and drank wine that was better than they deserved, better than anyone had planned, better than was reasonable for a small village wedding. And in the corner, a group of servants huddled together, whispering urgently. They had carried the water. They had poured it into jars. They had watched it transform. They knew exactly what had happened, and they knew that they had just seen something that should not be possible. One of them looked at Jesus, and their eyes met across the courtyard. Jesus gave the slightest nod. Not a command, not a threat, just an acknowledgement. The servant understood. This wasn't for public announcement. This wasn't for glory or fame. This was simply help given at the right moment. A family's honor preserved. A celebration saved. What none of the guests realized as they drank that miraculous wine was that they were experiencing something profound. The first public sign that God had entered the world in a new way. Water transformed into wine. The old made new. The ordinary becoming extraordinary. The impossible made possible. You won't believe what this moment meant for everything that followed. Mary watched from across the courtyard, a small smile on her face. She had known, not exactly what he would do, but that he could do something, that he would respond to the need, that her son was who she had always believed him to be, even when she didn't fully understand it. The disciples sat in silence, their worldview quietly shattering and reforming. They had followed this teacher, intrigued by his words, drawn by his wisdom. But this was different. This was power over the physical world. This was creation itself bending to his will. Who was this man they had chosen to follow? As the celebration continued into the night, the 6 stone jars stood against the wall, still full of impossible wine. Servants kept drawing from them, cup after cup, jar after jar, and the wine never ran out. The family's shame had been turned to honor. The disaster had become the highlight of the celebration, and it all happened so quietly that most people never even knew. The groom would tell his children about the wedding, where the best wine came at the end. The servants would carry the secret of what they witnessed for the rest of their lives. The disciples would remember this as the moment they first glimpsed the true nature of the man they followed. And Jesus simply sat with his mother, sharing a quiet moment of understanding, before the hour came when everything would change, when miracles would no longer be private acts of kindness, but public declarations of divine authority. But for now, in Cana, at a wedding nobody would forget, water had become wine, and nothing would ever be quite the same again.